I'd like to open by saying shalom and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community with friends and partners all over the city, the New York metropolitan area, and the state. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. And on each episode of Community Relations Corner, for our viewers, you certainly know, our regular viewers, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the honor and pleasure of getting to know over the course of my lengthy tenure here at JCRC-NY. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting the New York Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of the city, the state of the state, the state of the nation, and we'll be touching on the state of the world. Today, we have the great pleasure. It's really a delight to have the New York State Comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, known as Tom DiNapoli. And welcome to you, Mr. Comptroller.
Michael, it is great to be on the Community Relations Corner with you, my friend. And you mentioned your lengthy tenure. You forgot to use the word illustrious tenure as well. What a delight it's been for me over these many years back in my days in the legislature to get to know you and certainly to work with you and your team at JCRC-NY. I have learned much from you and have benefited from that partnership, and it's really a privilege to be with you.
Thank you. My feelings towards you are paralleled by your feeling towards me. We have a very warm and friendly relationship going back over years during your days in the New York State Assembly. Before we begin what would normally be a standard interview, I think we should just spend a moment talking about what's happening in the Middle East. We'll get to a little bit later in the interview talking about your trips to Israel. But considering the violence, and particularly last night, the firing of more than 200 rockets from Hamas-controlled Gaza into civilian Israel, into territorial sovereign Israel, as well as rockets being fired towards Jerusalem, that is just something which cannot be tolerated. JCRC has condemned Hamas and the other terrorist organizations for doing that. But I want to give you, Mr. Comptroller, an opportunity to say a few words about this as well.
Yeah, look, we certainly know Israel is in the most dangerous neighborhood of the world. That's not news, and we know tensions there are real and longstanding. But when you see a terrorist organization like Hamas and the Palestinian militants take advantage of those tensions and use it as a pretext to launch an attack on Israel. And we're not talking about one-off, missiles here and there. I mean, you're talking about a barrage. And I guess the latest news report that I heard before we started our conversation, 2 Israelis were killed in Ashkelon. You point out that some of these rockets and missiles have been directed towards Jerusalem, which is the home for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. I mean, the randomness of the attacks in terms of really indiscriminately targeting the civilian population in Israel is heartbreaking, is distressing. It's a reminder of how important our strategic relationship is with Israel, the support for military aid to be able to respond and hopefully intercept, and prevent some of these rockets from landing. That's not always possible, as we've learned. And that's not without sympathy for those who are killed in the Gaza Strip as well. News reports are of some number of children being killed. What the real number is, will be determined over time. But look, the bottom line is this: Israel's enemies that are in very close proximity to its borders will look for any opportunity to take advantage of a situation, escalate it, and inflict pain, damage, and death on Israel. So, as always, there's a lot to sort out, in the tensions that are happening there. We certainly hope for a lasting peace at some point. It's certainly been elusive. But in the meantime, we must condemn these attacks on Israel and I just hope that at some point, those that have some influence with Hamas will dial it back. It's not the appropriate way to deal with the many issues that exist in that part of the world.
Yes, I identify with everything that you have said. You said it so effectively and directly. We could probably spend the balance of our hour together just talking about these issues. We're going to go back to what we had planned in terms of this conversation between the two of us, knowing that the Comptroller of the state of New York stands with us in the Jewish community and many in the non-Jewish community as well, and in the state of New York with the state of Israel during these very, very difficult times. So thank you very much for always being there and for your solidarity. So let's now get back to the interview. And just as I generally do when we start Community Relations Corner, I always like to find out who my guests are or how they define themselves. So maybe a little bit about your background. I know you have lived on Long Island in Nassau County for a long period of time. Were you born there? And what motivated you to go into politics in the first place, leading to your election initially to the assembly?
Well, I'll give you the short version of that. I'm a lifelong Long Islander, and actually my parents were both born and raised on Long Island in Roslyn. And I grew up in Albertson, the next town over. So my family's been in that area for a long time. You know, like so many New Yorkers, you know, we're an immigrant story. My grandparents were the immigrants from Italy, and they met here, married, lived in Brooklyn. But after they got married, both sets of grandparents moved out to Long Island to have their families and raise my parents. So we're connected to Brooklyn. Very often, all roads lead to Brooklyn, right? But we've been out on Long Island.
You're talking to a Bronx boy, so.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, the Bronx folks end up in Westchester. The Brooklyn folks end up in Long Island. But you know, I certainly from my parents learned. You know, about being involved in the community. A lot of my parents' involvement was tied to what we were doing as kids, you know, Boy Scouts, Little League and such. But I certainly had that sense of being involved in a larger community. So when I was in high school, and I was in high school during those turbulent years of the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot going on. And, you know, the civil rights movement, the big disagreements over the war in Vietnam, labor issues. I remember we used to go to supermarkets to make sure they were selling Union grapes and lettuce, you know, with the United Farm Workers, the beginning of the environmental movement. You know, the first Earth Day happened when I was in high school. Other social movements, the beginnings of, you know, what was called back then gay liberation movement. This is all this turbulence happening. And although I grew up in a pretty conservative household and neighborhood, I very much was motivated, inspired, challenged by the times. And so as a high school student, I got very involved in some of those causes. I went to demonstrations against the Vietnam War, very much advocated for 18-year-olds to be allowed to vote. You know, folks forget that you had to be 21 to vote back then, but if you were 18 and you were a male, you were subject to the draft. And that was a big motivation, that folks that weren't supporting the war were being drafted, sometimes being killed. We lost a lot of lives in Vietnam, yet had no say in terms of the vote. So another cause was getting the voting age lowered to 18, which happened. And it took effect in my senior year in high school. And so because I've been active in all these issues, and I'm not bragging, but I was president of Mineola High School. I was elected by my peers. And I went to school board meetings, and I didn't like some of the things going on. And I said, you know what? I think I'm going to run for the Board of Education. You know, Board of Education on Long Island, you're elected. It's a public office. And I had the rather unique experience, Michael, is like, you know, I got a petition, and my high school friends knocked on doors with me, reached out to people, and May 3rd, right? So it's not too far from this date, May 3rd, 1972, I had the unique experience of my very first vote, and I voted for myself. And I won. I was the first 18-year-old elected to public office in New York. I haven't won every race since then. I've won most of them, but that experience of working within the system, a lot of folks back then were working outside of the system. I chose to work within it. To be involved at a very community level with the Board of Education, a lot of important responsibility. It wasn't a partisan office, so I really had the chance to get to know many people, regardless of political philosophy. With school issues, it's not Republican or Democrat. It has to do with what's good for the school children, and that really brought me into the larger involvement. My parents were good Republicans. I became a Democrat, but I got involved with the Democratic Party, and that led to my being elected to the state assembly in 1986. So I spent 10 years on the Board of Education, 2 terms as president. And I always had the desire to do public service full time. And I feel very blessed that I had 2 decades in the state assembly, the past 14 or so years as state controller. It's been a real privilege and certainly fulfilling the dream of that 18-year-old a long time ago, inspired by folks like the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, to be engaged and to try to make a difference. That's very much still who I am.
Yeah, well, thanks for all that background. What stands out from your 14 years at the state assembly that you want to share with our viewers? What was the highlight of that time frame that you were able to accomplish before you were appointed initially, before you were elected as state controller?
Wow. Well, it's 20 years, not 14. So don't.
14 years.
Yeah, controller. Yeah, maybe it's coming up on 15 soon. But first of all, it's a very different experience being a legislator versus being controller. So when I was in the legislature, I represented, about 125, 130,000 people in the neighborhoods, where I grew up, where my family was from, and you advocated for your district. And I certainly tried very hard, especially on the issues that were important in my area, protecting the environment, education. Increasingly, towards the end of my tenure, we spent a lot of time on healthcare, health insurance issues. So I think, trying to respond to people at a very human level, providing that, very personal constituent service was always important. But I also did try to be a legislator in Albany in terms of making law. And there were many, many issues that I worked on, particularly with the environment. And the last 5 years, I chaired the Environmental Conservation Committee. So I'd have to say, while there are many specific bills that I'm proud of that became law, if I had to pick one, right, not to spend too much time on the assembly career, but I had a great experience to be involved with many important Long Island stakeholders in preserving the Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens are on the east end of Long Island, over a key watershed that supplies pure drinking water for Long Island. Keep in mind, Long Island water is from the aquifer underneath, right? So it's not a surface drinking water supply. And there was real pressure to develop some of those most pristine lands. And working with Ken Laval in the Senate, my Senate counterpart, and with business community, environmental community, local government community, we came up with the Pine Barrens Protection Act. Those who drive out, to the east end this summer, they may see signs saying entering the Pine Barrens region. Well, that's because we came up with a legislative framework to implement an agreement that was reached back home to preserve 50,000 acres of unspoiled, environmentally sensitive land overlaying a very key part of the aquifer, and for a planned development for 50,000 acres around it. So preserving that core of the Pine Barrens, which to this day, is an important legacy for Long Island. If I had to point to one legislative achievement that I'd be most proud of, it would be that. There are many others, but I'll just leave it at that, Michael. I enjoyed being in the assembly. I met some wonderful people. But after 20 years, I'm glad I had the opportunity for a change and opportunity to be controller.
Well, yes, and that transition from being a legislator to being in the executive branch is a significant transition. But I am not sure that our viewers or even many New Yorkers understand what a controller does, and also how it impacts on day to day in the state of New York. So can you give us a primer on that?
Yeah, I'll give you a short primer, but you're absolutely right. I always say I have the best job in state government, but the one that nobody really is quite sure what it is that we do. So the title doesn't lend itself to explaining the position. And I often say we're in many ways the back office operation for state government. And the fact that folks may not know a lot about us is maybe a good thing. It means we're doing our job. You know, if you make a mistake, that's when people will know. So, you know, some of the basics, we do the payroll for, you know, for all state employees. We approve payments to contractors, vendors that are doing business with the state. We process contracts that go to nonprofits that may be getting a state grant, local governments as well. So again, if all that's working smoothly, then you're it's seamless. You're not going to know. We send out the pension checks for the state retirees for the pension system. We also invest the assets of the retirement fund to pay for those pension benefits. It's a big responsibility. So,
and you're the sole custodian of
sole fiduciary for what we will soon announce to be a over $250 billion pension fund, one of the largest state pension funds in the United States, third largest and one of the largest in the world. Fortunately, I have a very capable staff. I don't want people to think it's me sitting there with the Wall Street Journal and saying, buy this, sell that. It's a much more sophisticated process than that. But we also audit state agencies. We audit local governments, so providing accountability. We don't decide how much money is allocated where. That's for the governor and the legislature. But after they do the state budget and they make those decisions, we follow the money, make sure it's being spent appropriately. So auditing state agencies, public authorities, local governments, a big responsibility. We also have a budget and policy group that analyzes the state budget, state fiscal practices. We are partners in administering the oil spill fund. We return people's lost money, unclaimed funds, very popular activity that we're involved in. So, you know, in many ways, the depth and breadth of the Comptroller's office is significant, but it tends not to be, you know, the most visible office. You know, it's always a history of the office that, especially in New York City, I might add, folks tend to know the city controller a little more than they know the state controller. Upstate, it's obviously a little different. You don't have too many controllers elected other than the state controller outside of New York City, where you have the city controller. But we have 2,800 employees all across the state, mostly in Albany, fair number in New York City. We've been working remotely, like most folks have been. In fact, our Albany office is the only one that's been open through the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're getting the work done. You know, we're getting the payments, doing the contracts, pension checks are going out. So that's kind of the overall summary of many of our responsibilities.
And thank you. And what's the relationship that you have professionally within the structure of the state of New York with the governor, as an example, or with the AG?
Well, it's an important question because, you know, there are many times people say, oh, what is it like to have the governor as your boss? and I always have to say, well, actually, the governor is not my boss. It's an independently elected office. And I think the reason that it is independently elected is that because it is the oversight office, it is the chief fiscal office for the state. You know, that autonomy and that independence is key. And if you were appointed by the governor or served at the pleasure of the governor or were subject to the authority of the governor, you wouldn't have that independence. And so whenever they framed this many years ago to have this as an independent office, it was the right move. In fact, I will mention, just as a bit of history, that it used to be an appointed office back 1797 when it began. And what would happen is that the controllers would call out the legislature and the governor for misspending certain money. They'd get unappointed. And there were so many scandals. At one point, they changed it from an appointed office to elected. Another little history, Millard Fillmore was the first elected controller of New York State.
Really?
Went on to become president, as you know. I'm not predicting anything, but I just point that out as history. But that was to keep it independent. So same thing with the AG. The AG is the chief legal officer for the state. I'm the chief fiscal officer. The governor is the chief executive. But each of us are independently elected. You know, there are obviously times we work in partnership, and we look forward to that. But especially with our audit authority over executive agencies, Michael, there's always a bit of a tension. It has nothing to do with who the governor is.
Right.
And I can say, having served now with three governors, it's always been the case. There's always a little bit of tension, but I think it's deliberately set up that way for there to be institutional tension, not to be adversarial, but it's part of the checks and balances. So that responsibility to the voters, to the public, that's what preserves the independence of the office, and I think that's been key. So we work as best we can in any political environment in harmony, but we each have our own discrete roles, and sometimes, there's a little bit of, as I said, I won't call it conflict, I'll call it dynamic tension, and that's how it's set up.
And you opened the door a few moments ago with regard to the city controller that people might be more familiar with. So what is your relationship? You're the state controller. How do you relate, again, structurally to the city, regardless of who the city controller is? How do you relate to the city controller?
Well, in many ways, we operate on parallel tracks. The responsibilities are very similar. There are certain things in the city charter that the city controller does a little different than we do, but a lot of the responsibilities are similar. We do have audit authority, not over every city agency, but over many. So what we try to do is coordinate with the city controller's office, so we're not, doing the same work. There have been times where we have done some joint audits. We haven't done any of those of late, but there have been times. I've served with a number of city controllers now. I feel like I've been around a while. I began with Bill Thompson and John Liu and Scott, and there'll be a new controller pretty soon. So we do try to coordinate our efforts, but basically we have separate roles. Again, the city controller has some unique responsibilities in city government, but that accountability agenda we both share. And the city has their own pension funds, right? So the controller, and they have boards, but the controller is the key, person in terms of hiring staffs for the city pension funds. Even on pension fund, our staffs talk all the time. So I don't want to say it's fully coordinated, because it's not. It's more parallel. But I've always enjoyed a great relationship with the city controllers, and I look forward to that continuing.
Oh, thanks. And before we leave this part of the interview, I really need to ask you about political aspirations. Is there anything beyond the controllership that Thomas P. DiNapoli is interested in?
Well, thank you for getting my middle initial in. P is for Peter, people often ask. I say this repeatedly, and sometimes people don't believe me, but I really do think I have the best job in state government. I didn't plan to be the controller. As you remember, unusual circumstances propelled me into this position, and fortunately, the voters on 3 occasions have elected me. My plan is to run again for state controller, and I say that with a lot of contentment with the position. So. Aspirations are, to continue in this job. My only caveat to that is that I never expected to be state controller, and I've been around long enough to know circumstances sometimes present themselves. I'm not anticipating any change other than my plan to run for state controller, and I'm very content with that to be my political biography. I'm not prepared to take the Millard Fillmore path. Be nominated vice president and then have the president die so you become president. So I'm not anticipating that.
Well, thanks very much for your openness on that question, as per your openness all across the board. Let's talk about an issue which does impact on all of us, regardless of whatever position in life we have, and that's COVID, and that's this pandemic. You have a unique position to see what the true financial impact has been of this pandemic. What actually happened with regard to the state budget, and what does it mean in lay terms for all of us?
Well, I'll keep it top line, and it's been an evolving picture. So if we go back to a year ago,
yes,
the COVID came in March. And what you really saw in April and May is severe economic devastation, the economy being on hold. Certainly at a human level, many people losing their jobs, losing their income, at the very least reduced income. For state and local government, for New York City, local governments as well as New York State, tax revenue way down.
Yes.
Sales tax were down like 27%, in that quarter that was at the end of June 30th, that was impacted by COVID. And there was a real sense that how could we possibly balance our budget, balance the books. So, fast forward to where we are today, you saw slowly the economy recovering in 2020. So one gauge is sales tax revenue. The sales tax revenue has continued to be down compared to a year before, but the amount of decrease has gotten less and less. And somewhat unexpectedly, personal income tax collections, which again were down in the beginning of the year, started coming back. In fact, Division of Budget, their projections going back to the fall, we kept saying their projections are off. We are going to get better than they are projecting tax revenue from personal income tax. And in fact, fast forward to the budget process that was just concluded in April, you saw a combination of factors: the economy recovering, and the result was tax revenue coming in higher than projected, not necessarily back to pre-pandemic levels, but unemployment rate going down, revenues coming in. And the big game changer, Michael, was the federal aid. Going back in 2020, you got some federal support reimbursed for COVID-19 related expenses, but with the change in the presidency, with the change in the House, the American Rescue Plan, billions of dollars coming into the state, certainly for state government, over 12 billion over 2 years, billions for New York City, I think it's 5 billion for New York City, over 5 billion, close to 5 billion for local governments outside of New York City, money for schools, for hospitals. That really created a very different dynamic. So the budget, when the governor first presented it, which was going to be a very lean budget with cuts, the budget that was concluded, in fact, largely because of the federal money, was a very different budget. And then, as you know, the legislature made the judgment that a lot of folks were hurt significantly by COVID, and there were many issues that hadn't been addressed adequately, even pre-COVID. So some new revenues were put in place: mobile sports betting, legalized adult use cannabis, right, increase on taxes for upper income New Yorkers. It could be debated, the merits on each of those, but it happened. That's the role of the legislature and the governor to work that out. So you had increased revenue from the tax changes, significant money from Washington, an improving economy. So the budget that was put together made significant new investments, particularly in education and healthcare, a number of other priorities for the legislature. I certainly think it'll help us continue to heal. Long-term, what do we care about in the Comptroller's office? When you're in the legislature, you look very short-term. How do I get this budget done? What do I need for my district? What kind of, to use the old phrase, horse trading do I need to do so everybody gets enough of what they want? From the Comptroller's perspective, we say long-term, what's the impact of decisions today? So we're waiting for the updated financial plan, because what I want to see is, what will this do to the out-year budget gaps that we've traditionally had in New York?
Yes.
And are we aligning on a recurring basis our revenue and our spending? And especially on personal income tax, because that's very volatile, will some of these tax changes actually not produce the result that people expect? You hear it all the time, I'm sure. A lot of folks, especially after learning about being remote and being in Florida, wherever, many folks have been talking about maybe leaving New York. I hope that doesn't happen. But I think that's the kind of thing we need to look at and be careful about.
Yeah, and I think that's always the case with regard to balancing budgets, of having one-shots. And so the federal stimulus money is that one shot, and you said the following year and the year after that, can the economy come back? And just take a look at a couple of industries. One is the arts and Broadway as an example, and a second one is tourism.
Yeah.
I was in the city yesterday, and just walking a couple of blocks, I passed about 3 hotels. Those hotels before the pandemic were packed, and tourism hasn't come back, and when will it come back? So what are the projections here for the recovery of
Yeah,
the metropolitan area?
yeah. And you raise a good point on the federal assistance not being forever. And again, that gets back to the long-term perspective that we want to bring to the discussion about state finances. Same is true for the city. We've done a series of reports on the sectors of New York City's economy, retail, restaurants, tourism. Look, it's anybody's guess how long the recovery will take. Most folks seem to think it will be, not a question of months, but a question of years. There's no doubt that whether you're talking about the tourism industry or the subset of it, the restaurant piece of it, severe job loss early on. You're certainly seeing some signs of recovery, but it's all tied together, right? So Broadway will start to reopen in September, with a limited number of shows. We see more restaurants, capacities being increased, outdoor dining with the warmer weather. But again, these are going to be slow steps, and we need to see people coming back into the city. Whether those are the day trippers from Long Island and in New Jersey and upstate, or folks that want to fly in from other states. One of the big factors, Michael, is the loss of tourists from overseas.
Yep.
The overseas tourists spend more money than domestic tourists. Interestingly enough, those from China spend the most out of anybody. So with all the restrictions that are still existing, when will we see that international tourism come back? And we also have to be candid. We're all reading the papers. The comfort level of people to come back is not just a question of which venues will be open, although that's a piece of it. But it's also a question of public safety. And obviously we have big issues there. The shootings in Times Square just over the weekend, right? They were tourists involved in that. I mean, I know everybody's concerned and everybody's talking about it, but it's something that we have to deal with. People feeling comfortable riding the trains again and on the subways again. That has to do, with the office workers coming back as well, because they come in and they spend a lot of money. So I'm talking to you from Maiden Lane in the city. Generally, I'm in Albany, but I have to say the past week or two when I've been in the city, I see more foot traffic than I've seen, for a number of months. Some of that is weather, some of that is reopening, but to the point of your question, the tourism sector is a key part of getting the economy back. We need to see coordination between the city and the state. We haven't always seen that. Obviously the federal help with the PPP loans and the other federal aid targeted to shuttered venues and to the arts sector. It's key. Thank you, Chuck Schumer. Being majority leader has been a big boost for New York, in this regard. But it's going to take time. It's going to take years. It's not going to take months. But we need to stay positive. We need to, promote more of these outdoor venues, for the arts. People, I think, will feel safer in that regard. There's a lot of work to do, but it needs to be a coordinated effort.
And we're very pleased and thrilled and comforted to know that the New York State Comptroller is Tom DiNapoli, and he has all these interests at heart as you conduct your responsibilities professionally up in Albany or here in the city, wherever you are in the state. And one of your responsibilities, speaking about funding streams, is unclaimed funds. And I certainly want our viewers to be aware of the role that the state controller plays in that very, very important dimension of the controller's office.
Well, I always say it's the fun part of our job. People don't realize how they can get separated from their money. Usually it's an old bank account or a check that wasn't cashed. It could be like a health insurance check. It could be an individual. It could be a business. It could be a nonprofit. It could be a synagogue, any number of ways that there might be an account or money that after a certain period of time, if it's declared dormant or abandoned, gets turned over to the state controller for us to hold on to in perpetuity. People say, well, what do you do with the money? Well, actually the legislature appropriates money, but the accounts stay active forever. And we keep enough in reserve based on historic trends to return money. And if everybody came out of the woodwork tomorrow to claim this money, we'd have to present it. So for everybody listening, if you remember nothing else of what Michael and I are talking about, when you can't sleep tonight, go to your computer, just put in your search engine, New York State Comptroller, go to our website, click on unclaimed funds. We make it very easy for you now to search our database and apply online. If there's a match, you can get a check in a matter of days. We have accounts now valued over $16 billion, billion with a B. So some of these accounts go back to the 1940s, probably some of them will never be claimed. Also, if you find the name of a relative who may be deceased, parent, grandparent, you can claim that account if you're the rightful heir. We may need a little more documentation. In addition to the website, we have an 800 number that we staff during regular business hours, Monday through Friday, and that number is 1-800-221-9311. 1-800-221-9311. We want to return that money. We're returning, I think, about $1.5 million a day right now. During COVID, a lot of people were sitting home with their computers. We had a big spike in the number of people claiming money, and the money came in handy. So, but I'm glad you asked that, Michael, because we have a lot of money we want to return to people. I know a lot of folks have been hurting out there through the COVID time. No reason for us to hold on to this money. We want to get it back to you.
Right, and especially for estates that, as the controller said, if you have a deceased relative that you are responsible for that estate, put their social security number into the website and into that form, and you'll see whether the state is holding money that could be helping you or rather than sitting in some account in the state of New York. Okay. Well, now let's travel back overseas where we started the conversation, but on a much more positive note, with the New York State, the state of New York, and the state of Israel. What is the economic relationship between New York and Israel?
Well, it's obviously a very close relationship for many reasons. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say New Yorkers have a very strong connection to the state of Israel. Even New Yorkers who aren't Jewish. I mean, I think that's been part of our culture and our history, for a long period of time. So certainly the presence of Israeli entrepreneurs in New York is certainly very clear and obviously support for Israel in very tangible ways from the New York community is clear. I'm very pleased that, in terms of a dollars and cents connection, we have kept a very close tie through our pension fund and the monies that we've invested in Israel in a number of ways, which I think has strengthened the economic tie. We have now, there's always, with investments over a period of time, some of them you exit and you get the benefit of it. But, anticipating our conversation, Michael, we did a quick run of the numbers where we're at today. We have close to $700 million of money that New York has invested, much of that pension fund money. And I believe, first of all, it's been a good, from an economic point of view, a good and safe investment climate for us. As an example, Israel bonds, New York State has always been either number one or number two. We're always competing with Ohio lately because we do like a little bit of a competition with Ohio, but we've done in 2020 another round of purchase of Israel bonds, and again, that's part of our fixed income portfolio, safe, good return. So we do it because it's in our economic and financial interest, but it also is a secure investment as part of our fixed income. And then we've had other investments in terms of public equities, Israeli companies that are listed, but I've been most proud of some of the innovative ways that we have leveraged more of our private equity investments in the state of Israel. As you well know, because on our last trip there together, you joined me in some of the conversations and meeting with wonderful entrepreneurs and those managing funds in Israel to talk about ways in which we could build on our prior partnership. And when we came back from that trip, you remember Vicki Fuller, who was then our chief investment officer, was with us. We announced a $400 million new program with Hamilton Lane as our investment partner on the ground there of private equity investments in Israel. We've gotten now about half of that out the door. And so again, these have been good investments for us. But getting back to the origin of your question, and something that you and I heard when we traveled together on that last trip, many of the Israeli startups, Israel is a small country, right? So in terms of their market for their products or their services, they don't limit it, just to Israel. They have a global reach. And very often, the companies that we're investing in open up offices in the US, very often in New York. Right. So although we think of it as an investment in Israel, the reality is it becomes an in-state investment in New York because they're operating offices here, they're hiring people here. Right. So all of this creates an ecosystem of economic connectedness that I think is, look, Israel is our best ally, a reliable ally, and for security of investments, that's where you want to have your money being put to work. So I'm proud of what has been a growing relationship, certainly during my tenure as controller. It's been good for our investments, good for New York, good for our retirees, and I think has certainly helped to strengthen the Israeli economy as well.
Oh, very much so. And we know there are those who wish to harm Israel's economy and have launched a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. The governor issued an executive order a number of years ago, an anti-BDS executive order. How have you been able to implement Governor Cuomo's order?
Well, it gets back to our earlier question about different roles. So we work with the Office of General Services, which is charged with overseeing implementation of the governor's executive order. But we have our own order, because the governor's jurisdiction doesn't apply to our pension fund. So we came up with an anti-BDS policy, if you will, an order from me to screen any possible investments. And because if a company is engaging in a boycott, divestment, or sanction activity, we don't want New York money to be invested in that company or supporting it. So as part of our corporate governance group, as part of our pension fund, they do a continual monitoring, and we've engaged a partner advisory services in that regard. So whenever there is any report or suspected activity of a company engaging in BDS, we then follow up if they're in our portfolio of companies to really ask the hard questions to determine whether or not the reports are accurate. If in fact we find valid reason to suggest that they are engaged in supporting BDS, we then restrict investments, that we will no longer invest in those companies. Fortunately, we've only had a very, very limited number. I think actually now there's only one investment that is on the restricted list because of BDS activity. But I think between what the governor did in terms of those who do business with the state, what we did with the pension fund sent a very strong message that New York will not support in any way companies that engage in BDS activity. And some have challenged me on this. They said, well, what is freedom of speech? But I said, look, I can give you my own opinion about why support for Israel is key and why the BDS movement, which is meant to destabilize the economy of Israel, it should not be supported. They're our most important ally in that region. We should not be contemplating that. But I have another reason, and that is because of what we just talked about, the economic ties, the mutual ties, harming the Israeli economy. Given the $700 million, close to $1 billion we have invested there, that will harm us. If the Israeli economy is harmed, our investments will be harmed. And for me as fiduciary for the pension fund, I can't contemplate that. Maybe that's a self-interest, but it's a real interest. So I get very concerned, and sometimes we even hear it among some of our fellow New Yorkers, where they think BDS makes sense. It is meant to be a destructive policy. We should not support it. And as New Yorkers, given our connection, we can't afford to support it. That's a self-interest.
Right, right. The ROI, the return on investment, would be harmed if there be support for boycotting and divesting, et cetera. But if I'm not mistaken, there was a precedent associated with this with regard to Ireland. Am I correct?
Well, yes, because Ireland, they were they were having legislation, that in effect would be supportive of BDS, and we wrote, and actually we worked with you and your team to say, if you're going to adopt that legislation, that, from our point of view, would have us question any investments that we have in Ireland.
Right.
And I think they got the message, and they backed off. I'm not saying that the issue is dead over there. I don't think it's reared its head lately, but we made the point that if you want us to be an investment partner, with companies that are operating in Ireland, you can't be part of this because that would violate our policy
Right.
to be against BDS. So, it's interesting that you raised that. It shows the importance of being vigilant, not just in our own little world, but this,
Right.
unfortunately, as we know, there are those, particularly in Europe, who have been, buying into this, and we have to be opposed to it wherever it rears its head.
Great, thank you. Let's talk a little bit on the lighter side in regard to your trips to Israel. You had traveled to Israel with JCRC, I know, at least twice as a New York State Assembly member. And of course, the trip that you took as New York State Comptroller, and our viewers should know full well that the Comptroller paid for his own trip on that trip as State Comptroller, and his team that went with him was paid by the Comptroller's office, not paid by JCRC. JCRC paid for my being on the trip, and I was honored to accompany the Comptroller on that trip. But what kind of stands out, as I said, on the lighter side, as the highlight for you of any one of the trips? We don't have time to talk about all of them, but with all your trips to Israel, being in the country, and as a Christian as well, is it on a religious side? Is it the topography, the borders? What might it be?
Wow, all of the above. So I know we have another 2 hours in our conversation, so I can cover it all. And so, well, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I've been to Israel 5 times, actually. So not always with you, Michael, but I've enjoyed, I've learned so much from the trips with you, and that certainly is a time that I will always cherish and value. What you have done, not just with me, but so many elected officials, to really, expose us to what Israel is all about, has been, you've been the unofficial ambassador, and what an incredible gift you have been to all of us in that regard. So much stands out, on the lighter side, and maybe even on the less lighter side. First of all, so my first trip there was in 1987. And the last trip was 2-3 years ago when you and I went. Each of those trips, it was the dynamism of the country and the evolution of the country has been remarkable. So much going on, and even with the challenges. One of the trips I took was right about the time that the tensions were mounting with the Gulf War, and like nobody was there. We was with Congressman Scheuer led a delegation, the late Jim Scheuer, and that certainly was a more stark time. When I went in 1987, I remember I came back and I spoke at Temple Emmanuel in Great Neck. Rabbi Whittam invited me to speak after the trip, and I was full of, anybody that goes to Israel for the first time, Jewish or Christian, whatever, such enthusiasm for it. It was about 2 weeks before the first Intifada started. So, and I came with hope and positivity, and then, other things happened. So kind of that ever-changing landscape and the highs and the lows of what happens there. But I think that obviously on a personal level, what I always say, whatever faith you have, however much you have of it, you cannot help but be blown away when you're walking through Jerusalem. I mean, it's just an incredible experience. And I do remember, one of my most vivid memories from my first trip there was on a Sabbath evening. We went down to the Western Wall, and as the sun was going down, you had it all. You had the Muslim call to prayer ringing out. You had the church bells were clanging, and the yeshiva students were dancing to welcome the Sabbath. Right. All right there. Right. All right there. And everybody was stopped, whatever their business was, whatever disagreements or fights. The spirituality of that moment, and to see, the Muslim vendor with his prayer rug, and to hear the church bells, and to see the yeshiva students, it was a peaceful moment, a beautiful moment, and a reminder how sacred the place is for everybody, and kind of underscores why is peace so elusive to this sacred area to everyone. I think the energy and the resilience of the Israeli people, startup nation, certainly from 1987 to this decade, to see the evolution of the Israeli economy, to see the assimilation of immigrants, right? So back to 1987 and over the years, to see the Ethiopians, and I saw one of the centers where they were being integrated, and the Russians, and I think it was a Beersheba. They had an overabundance of concert cellos and maestros, and they had an influx of all these wonderfully talented people from Russia. So they had like multiple symphonies and orchestras. The ability, and I'll try to wrap it up because I could go on for 2 hours. The ability, which I think often is missed in the press here, people do figure out how to get along day by day. A lot more than sometimes there's this image that, whenever I go to Israel, some of my friends have say, oh, be careful, be careful. I have to say, even when I was there, at the time of the Gulf War, and there weren't too many tourists there, because of the Israeli priority on security, I've never felt unsafe there. Now, there are times where you have to be more careful. I understand that. And some of the trips, into the West Bank and so on, obviously you needed to take certain precautions. But the ability of people, even on a very personal level, to coexist, Arab and Jew, it happens more than perhaps credit is given for that. I'm not saying everybody loves each other, that there aren't tensions, but there's a lot more getting on. Why? Everybody's on top of each other. Mm-hmm. And to your point about borders, I think for Americans, we have no sense about proximity to other countries. I mean, unless, my friends in Buffalo, they look at Canada, right? But not exactly a hostile relationship. But how close that neighborhood is. And I remember on one of our trips, we were down in Sderot, and we went to one of the homes where a missile had recently been fired from Gaza. So in reading about what's happening, yesterday and today, I remember, Michael, we were on a hill looking right into the Gaza Strip. There was no distance.
Kobe's Hill.
I remember we were there for a while, and you said, "All right, we've been up here too long. We've got to, go back." So I think that understanding and realization of just how, in many ways, precarious Israel's existence always has been. I don't think, I hate to say this way, but unless you see it, you might not really understand what that means. And now with technology being what it is, and more sophisticated weapons, and well-financed belligerents towards Israel, Israel can never let its guard down. And America could never take for granted how fundamental our partnership is with Israel to keep it safe and secure. So on the lightest note, I don't want to get negative or heavy on it. I look, Israel's been through a lot. Israel will continue to survive, will continue to thrive. The resilience of the people will prevail, even over the internals, right? Everybody's curious, what will be the new government? How will it be formed, and so on? Israel will get through it, but we have to be willing to stand by Israel. And I believe the resolve in America is still there. I think it's a bipartisan support. Maybe there've been some cracks in that at times, but certainly from a New York perspective, and thanks to leaders like you that keep us informed about what's happening, I think the New York support for Israel is as strong as it's ever been. And certainly as long as I'm around, be it in office or as a private citizen, my support will be there.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. We really do have to wrap up, but I don't not want to ask you the following question, meaning I'm going to pose the question regarding anti-Semitism. We just had the experience up in Riverdale of some horrible acts of anti-Semitic violence. What role can a comptroller play? What role can you play in your ability to audit organizations and individuals to assist in combating hate and anti-Semitism across the board? Again, it's not just hate against the Jewish community. What's happening with the Asian community is also.
Yeah, we see those terrible incidents. And I was very proud to stand with you in Queens at the anti-Asian hate rally, was it 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago. Look, we're not perfect here in this country. And even in a diverse community like New York, we see these instances of bigotry and hate directed at any group that's defined as the other. In the case of Riverdale, I guess they apprehended the individual who was responsible. But again, it underscores the importance of vigilance and of speaking out, when these incidents happen. So what we've tried to do in this regard is, with our audit function, look at some of the programs and laws that have been set up in New York to deal with this. So we did an audit of reporting of hate crimes by law enforcement, particularly NYPD, and also at the state level, Department of Criminal Justice Services. And we found some challenges there, not fully reporting, some not clear understanding about how to report which incidents. And if you don't have the data, you can't have the response. So we saw some progress because of that audit. We also did an audit a couple of years ago on what's happening in the schools. We have a New York State law. It's called the Dignity for All Students Act, which is meant to guard against any incidents of discrimination, harassment, bullying of students in the public schools based on their religion, their ethnicity, their race, gender, sexual orientation. And again, we found a very, uneven picture in terms of how we were protecting, our youngest citizens in this regard. We made some strong recommendations to State Education Department, and we're pleased that we've seen some progress in that regard. So, I've said to my audit folks, besides looking at dollars and cents, and that's obviously a lot of what we do in the controller's office, right? We're called the bean counters, Let's look at the important programs that are relevant to people's lives, and let's audit against those. So, we'll look for other opportunities, because I'm sad to say, despite all the great efforts, particularly of the faith communities, we still have people that just seek to hurt those who they define as the other, or who, for whatever reason, they seem to have a grievance with. And whether that's targeting, a synagogue, or, or a church, or a mosque, or, of late, the anti-Asian violence and harassment, we can't let our guard down. And it's important why, as we wrap up, I just want to say again, the work that JCRC New York does, not only in terms of knitting together a Jewish response to these issues, but the interfaith work, I think, has been so key.
Thank you.
And again, in that regard, Michael, I know none of us believed you would ever retire, and I gather that's going to happen. I just want you to know, number one, we don't expect you to be on the sidelines completely. And number two, your leadership of JCRC New York has been so impactful. For folks like me, really has been transformative in many ways, and I don't say that lightly. And your ability to just navigate through all the communities during good times and during bad times, when people are feeling under siege, or when people are feeling positive about where we're at, you have been such an indispensable link in the fabric that makes New York the special place that it is. I'm sure I speak for everybody that's on this, podcast, and the thousands out there that are going to be honoring you as you wrap up your tenure. you stand out really as a beacon of inspiration for all of us. And if we had more leaders like you, we would have less trouble in our city and in our state. And I God bless you and Phyllis and your family. I want you to stay healthy, stay involved. I'm going to continue to call upon you for guidance. And I know you're still going to be in the forefront of fighting for all the good causes, not just for Israel, not just for the Jewish community, but for what will make us a more caring and inclusive society here in New York. And to me, you will always be one of my heroes and one of my champions. And if for no other reason, I'm glad I ran for office, so I got to know you, Michael Miller, over the years.
Oh, wow. Thank you very, very much. I'm really humbled by what you had to say. And I feel towards you the same warmth that you expressed towards me. Tom DiNapoli is really a mensch. And we can say that term without commitment and unseriously. That's not true with regard to Tom. Thomas P. DiNapoli is a true mensch and a man of his word. And somebody who really is interested in the people. And so it's been my pleasure to have befriended you, and your pleasure, I guess, to have befriended me. We'll still maintain contact with one another. And most importantly, I have to thank you, express my gratitude for this delightful hour that we've spent together having this conversation, which could go on longer, but we'll bring it to a halt now. My thanks to you, to your team, to Eric Greenberg, and all the people in your shop who work tirelessly to ensure the success of the Comptroller's office, but particularly to Tom DiNapoli himself. Thank you so much for joining us. I thank our viewers for watching and listening, and look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of Community Relations Corner. Toda rabah. Thank you very much. Shalom, and be well.
Thanks, Michael.